Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect. Today I'm going to try my hands at Dragon Valley. The scenario states that the pillar mountains in this Chinese valley provide a picturesque but extremely difficult terrain for nature-themed attractions. It is your task to turn this unusual landscape into a blossoming theme park without destroying the geological features that characterize it. And the goals are to get an experiences rating of at least 80%, have 800 guests in the park, and some optional goals that we can probably use to make an extra bit of money. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and say that this is probably the most difficult scenario in the whole game based on, well, not generally, but definitely when it comes to the terrain, because as you can see, it is very unusual and there's a lot of very difficult terrain that we have to play with. Not to mention that the map is also quite limited. It can be very hard to see exactly where our borders start and end, but as you can tell, it's kind of going around these mountains here and all the way back here, and then we end up here at the entrance. So there's definitely quite some land, but it's all kind of difficult to work with. And another thing to mention, there we go. There is no land available for purchase, but we also cannot terraform. As you can see, it's just completely not an option, which means that this is also going to be a bit harder in that sense. We can't flatten anything. We're going to have to work with the terrain that we have. Why the Chinese authorities decided that it's okay to build theme parks and buildings here, but not to change anything else about this geological stuff, you know, it already seems like we're stepping on UNESCO heritage grounds here. I'm not entirely sure, but, you know, we can make some money off of it, so why complain? Also, I have to say that this scenario is based on the real-world Pillar Mountains. Their name, I'm definitely going to butcher, but they're called Zhangjiajie. It's a national park in China. There's definitely not going to be any amusement parks in real life there, but there is an interesting gondola and also an elevator that looks really cool. Definitely an awesome travel location. Anyway, let's get started and see what we can make of this. Alright, so 1 second into this video and I already need to fact check myself. There are a whopping 3 gondolas in Zhangjiajie National Park in real life, which is absolutely insane, and I have talked about this in videos before, but I don't think I have in Parkitect videos, so here goes anyway. I find this a really cool revelation because I am super into gondolas, chairlifts, and any kind of ropeway. So these gondolas look so interesting. They've got a bunch of Leitner and Doppelmayr gondolas going through the valleys, reaching the cliff tops, which is absolutely the dream. Hopefully one day, you know, I'll make it out there. We never know, but for now, I just found it a super interesting and intriguing fact. There's actually also a mod for Parkitect with chairlifts and gondolas, which looks really good. I've already tried it before and it works super well. Unfortunately, I am sticking to the vanilla game for this campaign mode, but if I were to use mods, and if you're playing this campaign yourself and you're allowing yourself to use some mods, I would highly recommend trying out the chairlift / gondola mod for this map because it seems like a perfect fit and I think you can probably do some really interesting things with it. Anyway, I'm already heading very much off topic as per usual at the start of this video, so let's actually get to the subject at hand. My first building in this scenario, and I know I've said this before, but I think the first building and also some of the other first buildings that you build in any given scenario, for me at least, are always kind of a trial, an experiment to see what kind of style you can stick with for the rest of the scenario. Obviously, every scenario either has a different theme, or you want to force yourself to have a different take on a theme that you've already done before. So for me, these kinds of first buildings are always a nice test run to see what else I can do differently this time, and if there are any more different techniques and stuff like that that I can invent. And this time around, I decided to try and go for a small Chinese pavilion. Well, I say small, but it's actually quite large, here at the entrance to cover an information stand. And this was already my first attempt at a new way of doing Asian roofs. Asian roofs have always been one of my favorite challenges in Parkitect, just because it's something that the game isn't really made for. Typically in real life, Asian roofs are these large overhanging roofs with lots of decoration and curves, and those are all just things that are really hard to get around in the blocky, stylized, and very much grid-based world of Parkitect. But in this case, I came up with a strategy to try and get around that a little bit and add some more flair and interesting tidbits to these roofs, and that is to use diagonal basic arch shapes to try and make some of the ridges and decorations on this roof. And even build an entire top part of the roof using the basic shapes only. And I think it actually works out quite alright. I'm pretty happy with the final results. Here you can see that we get an interesting shape with definitely those kind of very stylized decorations that you typically see on the corners of Chinese roofs, where they could put maybe even some dragon heads or similar decorations. And while it definitely doesn't look exactly the part, I think zoomed out enough and given the very stylized art style of Parkitect, it works well enough. I was also trying to go out of my way to come up with a new way to do Asian style roofs, because there have been many occasions already where I've tried to do Asian style roofs. The first being for the initial Parkitect playthrough that I did once Parkitect came on early access on Steam. Then of course I made the Pagoda Valley scenario for the base game campaign and Sakura Gardens as well. And then when it came to my playthrough on YouTube, Pagoda Valley was one of my first attempts at trying a new kind of Japanese architecture. And Sakura Gardens for me, up till now actually, is actually one of my favorite scenarios in terms of how the park turned out. And my favorite tackle of any general East Asian theme so far. I feel like that was really the point where I kind of finally understood how to properly do Asian roofs in Parkitect. And now that I got to this scenario, I really wanted to come up with a different way to do it. Also, given the fact that every Asian, or at least East Asian style scenario in Parkitect that I've done so far has all been Japanese, and this time I'm having to give Chinese a go, which is something that I'm not quite as used to as Japanese. I really wanted to, do it differently. Now, obviously, I've made this scenario already, so I've done a little bit of practice already. You can see there's an entrance building with the golden roof, and there's also one building to the left here, actually standing just outside the park borders, but giving some extra decoration to this map. So those were kind of some practice runs as well, but those still use the general approach of roofs that I used in Sakura Gardens as well. So this whole basic shape strategy that I went with for the first building in the scenario is a very new thing. Anyway, I need to catch up with the time-lapse I see, because I have long been building a roller coaster and I have barely commented about it. So you start off this scenario with a bunch of rides that I now realize I forgot to show off at the start of this video, but not to worry, we'll get back to what I have available in the next section of this video. But for now, all that's important to know is that we start off with the Mack Rides Extreme Spinner. And to be honest, whenever I start playing a scenario in this DLC and I know the Extreme Spinner is available, I just can't do anything but build this coaster. It's just so much fun to build every time. It's an amazing coaster in real life. Actually, I have something to report about, but yeah, I'll do that in a second. But yeah, it's just such a fun coaster to build. It's so versatile. You can do lift hills, you can do launches, and it has great stats as well. And in this case, I figured it would be a really good coaster to have it snake around the park, interact with everything that it can interact with, so it gets interaction with the paths. We have, in the future, we will have a path going straight through its vertical loop, so that's really interesting. But then it can do some interaction with the buildings and scenery like that as well, so it's gonna fly over and through some buildings too. And finally, of course, we've got really interesting terrain here, so it's definitely gonna have some terrain interaction too. You've got that part after the launch, you launch into a 0G roll and then go into a helix that kind of reminds me of Superman and Iron Rattler at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, where the coasters go over these cliff sides that are made from this quarry that the park is located in, which kind of gives some similar terrain interactions as this park does, I think. So that's really cool as well. And then later on, we're definitely gonna build more buildings and paths around this coaster as well. But yeah, what I quickly wanted to talk about is right now I'm recording a video for the first time building one of these coasters when I've actually been on one of them in real life as well. So this summer, Me and my friend Joey went to Plopsaland, Belgium to ride, what's it called again? Ride to Happiness, which is a Tomorrowland-themed extreme spinner. And as it stands, it's only one of 2 extreme spinners in the world. But from the general consensus that I've heard and seen and read, and from anybody I've talked to who has been on both coasters, it seems to be about the best one in the world. There's also Time Traveler in Silver Dollar City, which was the first, which was open already a few years ago. But it seems, definitely even judging from POVs, that Ride to Happiness is a little bit more intense, and it's got some absolutely insane elements. Overall, I don't know if every coaster of this type is going to be like Ride to Happiness, but having been on that and now imagining what the extreme spinners that I built in scenario mode are going to be like for guests is really fun. The 0G roll is undoubtedly going to be amazing. I remember riding the 540 degree twist that Ride to Happiness has and going absolutely crazy how whenever you get the right spin, it just somersaults you backwards and forwards in insane ways that I've never experienced on a roller coaster. And even experiencing airtime is a crazy experience and different every time. Ride to Happiness has some of the strongest airtime I've ever experienced on a coaster, but besides that, you never know what direction you're gonna get the airtime in. One time you're backwards, the other time you're forwards, and sometimes you're spinning or you're sideways or in whatever direction you're going. It's absolutely nuts, and we need more of these coasters in the world. Unfortunately, I don't have much of a say about that in the world, but at least in my scenarios, I'm gonna build these things for my guests whenever I can, because I am instantly a huge fan. Anyway, that's it about the coaster. Let me talk a bit more about what other strategies I've got going on for this whole area of the park. If you were a very observant viewer, you might have noticed that when I opened up this park, I had a continue button, which means that I was already playing this park before. And to be very frank, most of the times I would play test these parks a little bit before passing them on to Sebastian and Garrett to do the finishing touches. And in this case, I actually stuck with the layout that I had during my playtime session or my playtest session. So all of the path work and the rides that I've placed at the start of the map here are very heavily based or loosely based on the playtest map that I built. The theming is completely different, so that's definitely its own thing for this playthrough. But I figured the layout just worked too well with that teacups ride sitting just beneath that cliff corner and then putting a carousel over here to have some amazing views on all the sides, and also the path that goes down from the top of the entrance there, which is... It's funny how the entrance is actually at the highest point of this whole park, at least elevation-wise. And it just kind of worked too well, I figured. So I stuck with that. It also means that I have the stalls right next to my delivery building, which is definitely gonna come in handy when it comes to hauling goods to the shops. So all things considered, I thought it just worked too well not to go for it again. Besides, this is a park where there's no terraforming to be done, so while you can technically just tunnel your paths into the ground, I didn't want to build any tunnels, or at least try to avoid tunnels as much as possible, and if I do use them, keep them as short and, close to the cliffside as possible, because in a scenario where you can't terraform, building tunnels everywhere just kind of seems like cheating. And I remember back in Roller Coaster Tycoon, scenarios where you can't terraform wouldn't allow you to go underground anyway, because you normally need to terraform some way to even allow yourself to go underground, because you needed those vertical cliff faces, which is not the case in Parkitect. So in that sense, it's a lot easier, but for some reason, I guess my Roller Coaster Tycoon experienced mind feels like it's cheating to build tunnels when you're not allowed to terraform. And I guess it would also make sense given the fact that these rocks are, well, really natural heritage, that it would be kind of weird to just go in and out of these things. Besides, I'm not sure if they could even support all of this, and I say this knowing full well that we're within the suspense of disbelief that this is all just a game anyway. But I'm not sure if these rock faces could really support all of the weight of all these rides and roller coasters. Probably not. because in real life the rock pillars and stuff like that are created through erosion, and I think it's really just wind erosion and the like. So given the fact that they're probably not very strong types of rock to erode like that, I also think they probably wouldn't give a very good foundation to build all kinds of shenanigans like this on, but who knows? I am not a geologist. That's just my kind of amateur take on the whole thing. So yeah, that's as far as I went there. Also, I decided to build some stuff outside of the rocks, give it some extra supports, give it some extra rock work as well, which you'll see me do throughout this scenario, just to make it look a little bit nicer. I don't hate the way that rocks in Parkitect have this kind of stripes effect. You see all of these black and grey stripes on the rock, on the cliff sides, which, you know, works well enough for the cartoony aesthetic, but every now and then I feel like it's nice to also add some different textures on the sides, just to have some variety to it and allow myself to put some detail into the cliff faces as well. Just because of how vertical everything in this park is. Most of the time, a lot of your screen space will be taken up just by cliff faces, so I feel like it would be kind of lame not to decorate them a little bit as well. Now at this point you'll also notice that I'm trying to add a huge variety of colors too. I basically just looked up whatever Chinese buildings I thought were interesting and took color schemes from all of them and just jumbled them all together, and I'm just kind of haphazardly placing buildings everywhere. It's probably not the most authentic way to create this Chinese experience, but I thought it looked interesting, and especially from an above perspective, it really kind of gives the illusion, or at least that's what I attempted to do here, that you have this whole town built on the cliff faces instead of just a single palace or some kind of effort to try and build something that's coherent. I'm trying to make it seem like it's been built in different ages, or just kind of growing organically into what it is today. Also, I'm being very experimental with the colors sometimes. You'll see me recolor things every now and then just to try and make everything fit together. But there are some different general themes that you can probably already see. So for instance, the entrance building together with the information kiosk and also the tower over there, which supposedly hides an elevator for people who can't walk the stairs, are all in the same style. And then we also have the big carousel building and some buildings around that, which have a different color of wood and different roof color and overall details and style, which I think actually also almost kind of goes into a Japanese aesthetic as well. But that's the thing, the Japanese basically got a lot of their architecture cues from the Chinese dynasties long ago, a while ago, so it all kind of comes from the same point of view. But anyway, it's a big mix of colors and styles basically is what I'm trying to say, and sometimes it took some trial and error to make things fit together and not seem too messy. I'm really trying to hit that balance of where it seems organic and messy enough, but at the same time still like everything is trying to adjust to each other and not seem too weirdly out of place, if that makes any sense. And I think that's also part of the fun of going for a park that's inspired by Chinese architecture as opposed to Japanese, is that you can use many of the same kind of roof shapes and general language of architecture, but one of the most clear distinguishing features of Chinese architecture compared to Japanese is that there's a lot more paint. Japanese architecture tends to use unpainted wood, except in some cases where they do use red painted wood sometimes, but they don't go with any crazy colors like green and blue decorations, and these are things that you do see in Chinese architecture, so it's a lot more colorful and in that sense also more interesting to build. I think also a little bit harder because I was a little bit more unsure of what I could get away with, whereas with Japanese you just stick with the Japanese color schemes and you're pretty much always good to go, and it will always be realistic, especially if you're just sticking to natural colors and unpainted materials as they typically do in Japan. But China is a different story. Another way in which China is quite different is in using more stone walls, which is something that you do find in Chinese architecture, but in Japan, once you're above the foundations, mostly everything is from wood. and paper screens. Also, famously, Chinese architecture was a lot quicker to adopt Western imports like furniture, tables and chairs and things like that. And as a result, you kind of get different shaped rooms as well, whereas Japan, even to this day, has held on a lot more to their traditional styles of even arranging buildings and rooms and houses with shifting walls and traditional Japanese tables and things like that. Maybe I'm already getting off topic a little bit, but I remember long ago already doing a bunch of research on what the differences between Japanese, Korean, and Chinese architecture are, because while they look super similar, if you do read up on the differences a little bit, you can usually tell them apart if you see pictures of buildings. Remember, one of the subtle differences that you can find as well, for instance, is that while Japanese is overall slightly more simple, and one part of that is that Japanese curved temple roofs will always have straight sections in the middle of the roof and will only start to curve upwards at the edges and at the corners. Whereas with Korean architecture, for instance, you can find buildings where the roof curves for the entire length of the building. And, you know, these are just some of the subtle touches that can really differentiate these styles. None of this is going to be very relevant to Parkitect, of course, but if you're building in a different game like Planet Coaster, it's definitely something to keep in mind if you really want to try and go for something authentic. And, you know, at the end, I haven't completely studied Asian studies or anything like that, and I'm no architect, but it's still fun to talk about this stuff, but take everything I say with a grain of salt, of course, and if you're really interested in this kind of topic, definitely do your own research as well. But this goes for any YouTuber. Never trust whatever YouTubers say, especially if they say it in a cool accent or with very nice animated graphics. Usually they're just spouting nonsense. I was gonna say a different word there, but you know, have to keep it PG-13. Anyway, let's get back to the topic at hand. I just always get distracted by so many things. We're getting into what I would call the last section of this first section of time-lapse, which is decorating this whole area and giving it some of the final touches, also working on the station of the coaster and the surroundings. So I'm adding some general decorations on the paths, some lanterns and benches and lamps and all of that stuff, just to breathe some life into it. And speaking of life, as you might have noticed, at this point the guests are basically in full force and they're enjoying this spinning coaster a lot. And if you see my budget on the bottom left, it's honestly way too good of a coaster. You know, for a long time I was wondering whether one coaster would even make this park commercially viable. At the whole first part of this time lapse, while I was building stuff, I was really scared of building things and having to lose everything just because my park wouldn't make a profit. And at this point, honestly, I couldn't care anymore, because clearly this coaster was way too good and putting way too much money in my pockets. And already at $20,000 with just one coaster and a few flat rides, with all of this scenery being built at the same time, was kind of insane to me. But I guess it just kind of speaks to the power of the extreme spinning coaster. It's just that good. Anyway, when it comes to building, I normally don't copy-paste a lot. It's something that I try to resist doing as much as possible, just to make every building unique and try to like come up with new ways of making buildings while playing the scenario a little bit as well. But in this case, there is just so much very particular stuff going on with the basic shapes, and it took me so much effort to build some of these roofs as well, that I ended up making a couple of blueprints of different roof pieces and decorations that I made, just to make my life a little bit easier and save some time. You know, you gotta work smarter, not harder. And it's always nice to have these blueprints and then be able to recolor them afterwards or make some small adjustments just to make buildings different. So that's the strategy that I'm going with this scenario. Also, the coaster station is basically built in the exact same style as the carousel building, although of course with a very different shape and altogether different look, but the color scheme is the same, and I'm drawing from the same pieces that I blueprinted from the carousel building. So hopefully that should give this whole area some continuations. What is the word? Continuity. There we go. As well. Also, this is the part where lots of roofs start overlapping, and all of these overhanging roofs start creating these layers. This park is very vertical, which is something that I love. It's something that I find very hard to add to my scenarios when you're starting off with a flat map. But once you get that verticality and you start having paths that cross each other and interact with rides and different levels and lots of buildings stacked on top of each other, it's just so much fun to build, and it's so much fun to look at. And it allows for every part of the park to be this crazy diorama where lots of stuff is going on. So yeah, it's very time consuming. I already know that this is going to be my longest episode ever in this whole series, and probably my first time that I break through the 1 hour mark, although I say that not having finished the rest of the video yet, so we'll see if that's true. But I think so. It's probably gonna happen. Anyway, at this point, I figured I would do something that I always forget to do until the end of my scenarios and actually build a staff room. You know, this time I'm gonna try to be a better employer. I'm gonna give my staff bathroom breaks as well. At some point I'm probably gonna have earned enough money to launch myself into space with this extreme spinner, and you know, that's gonna be another nice bathroom break for my employees as well. So I think we're only heading in the right direction with this company. So, of course, this being a very heavily themed scenario, I wanted to heavily theme our staff room as well and put lots of decoration around it. Make that, well, it's not ugly, but make that, yeah, actually pretty ugly staff room in the game look very different and unrecognizable from what it was. Also, I wanted to put golden spires on all the buildings because we're just that extravagant. Anything that has a spire gets a golden spire on top of it. So, you know, just extra decoration, extra color, lots of stuff going on. That's what we're here for. Now, I'm gonna skip ahead in the time-lapse a little bit to skip to what is my favorite thing in this whole playthrough so far. And no, it's not this roof yet. This is actually built just before I start building my favorite thing in this playthrough. But it's the start of things to come, for sure. So here we have the mid-course brake run for the extreme spinning coaster, and to be honest, the height of this mid-course brake run is not really realistic because it's at the same height as the 0G roll that follows it. So I think realistically, if a coaster were to stall on this brake run and then continue afterwards, it wouldn't be able to complete the track, which is a huge oversight. Which is technically not an oversight because I realized it while I was building this brake run, but I figured, you know what? Form over function for this one, honestly. I couldn't care less. I just really wanted to have this brake run here with a roof over it, with right next to the waterfall. It just looked way too cool. And at least in the layout, the section that follows this mid-course brake run is a lot shorter than the section that's before it. And the launch is not a block section due to the fact that it's not a chain lift and the coaster train can't be stopped on top of it. So very rarely will a coaster train have to stop on this block break. It's really only there so that I can technically have enough block sections to run 2 trains. That said, there is the possibility that a train will stall on this thing, but you know, in that case, I'm just gonna approach this thing as some real life coasters do that have messed up block break sections and take it, you know, for what it is. We're gonna have to do some evacuations every now and then. I think that's a worthy price to pay for a layout that looks way too cool to do something else. Also, I know I could have left out the 0G roll after the block break section, but also that thing just looks way too cool, and the way that both of the helixes before and after the 0G roll end up spinning around the terrain pillars, and I swear this is something I didn't come up with when I was designing this scenario, but it all just fits way too well. Anyway, after that I decided to build the most ambitious building in this playthrough so far. So I've built many pagodas in Parkitect, but I've mostly just built Japanese pagodas, which is nice because Japanese pagodas are very simple. They're typically just 3 or 5 or 7 floors in some crazy cases. There used to be 9-floor pagodas as well, but that's already besides the point. But Japanese pagodas are nice and simple. They don't have many floors and they're basically just square. They're quite simple in terms of their shape, so they're very easy to make in Parkitect. In fact, I even have a Lego set of Tokyo that has a pagoda in it, and it's one of the easiest things to build in Lego, and it just looks right. You can look at it and know that it's a pagoda. It just works. Whereas with Chinese pagodas, there is more variety in their designs. There are many different types of Chinese pagodas, but typically they're also hexagon shaped, which in Parkitect, given the fact that this game is not a huge fan of diagonals, even though they are in the game, but they're a lot more limited in general as a piece than straight pieces, it just makes things a lot harder. But I really wanted to build one of these iconic hexagon pagodas that you see in China, with a crazy color scheme as well, so that's what I ended up doing. And this thing is gonna have to be built almost exclusively out of basic shapes. Of course, I'm using some pillars as well for the vertical pillars, obviously, some of the wooden posts that this pagoda has, but the bulk of the work is all done by basic shapes. And actually, while building this thing, I found that the most difficult thing was to make sure that the measurements were right. I didn't want to build this thing and make it look inconsistent, like certain floors were taller or lower than others, or were offset more than others. So this is going to have to be a completely straight pagoda where every floor is 1/4 of a grid space smaller than the floor below it on all 4 sides. Technically, it's all 8 sides, but you know, the grid is a square grid, so on all 4 sides, and then just connecting the sides. And yeah, that's basically that. This just made me wonder if it's possible to make a theme park game or switch to a hexagon grid. That would be absolutely insane. I mean, it's possible. Technically, hexagons... Actually, no. They don't. I'm sorry. I messed up this whole part that I was talking just now. It's an octagon. I'm sorry for anybody who's been facepalming themselves in this whole time. Octagons have 8 sides, hexagons have 6 sides. Anyway, that was my brain fart on my part. I'm sorry, but there is no way to build an octagon grid. There is a way to build a hexagon grid though, but I'm not sure if that's as useful in building. I'm getting very off topic again. So yeah, this is an octagon pagoda, and as you can see at this point, every floor is clearly 1/4 of a grid space smaller than the one below it, so you really get that nice straight tapering form. And once we get to the top floors, everything's becoming a little bit easier to connect to each other as well, because the way that diagonal and straight basic shapes connect to each other in this game can sometimes be a little bit tricky, and given the fact that both the walls and the roofs and even some of the red horizontal wooden details of this pagoda are all made out of basic shapes, there was a lot of trying to work out how to make these things fit together and connect on a grid. But in the end we got there, so I'm pretty happy with that. And really at this point I'm just starting off with the general shape of the pagoda, really trying to work out how to make this roof and how to also make it look convincing. But at this point I was pretty happy with how it turned out, and the overall shape was in place, so it was time to try and add some detail to it and some finishing touches and really make it look the part. So one of the things that I tried doing is adding some paper windows to this thing, at least some different colors so that the walls wouldn't be entirely white, and I would actually have some other colors to play with as well. So I'm putting that between the different floors with the basic shapes as well. And then of course the fact that we're working with lots of red wooden details means that we can always add more pillars and stuff like that, but I decided to forgo that because, well, I think it just works well enough this way, and with how every floor tapers off, it would be really hard to add more detail without the tower looking inconsistent. And at this point I think it's looking consistent, and while I could add more detail, I think consistency is really key here. So sticking with how the tower looks at this point, it's time to head to my final project of this time-lapse anyway, and then I promise I'll finally give a quick real-life overview and check how the coaster works and what the POV is like and all that good stuff. But first, I want to work on a station for another coaster that's not here yet, but I had a station for it in mind. So I decided to build the station before I built the coaster, which is not something I normally do. But here I just had to do it because there was this idea for the whole scene that you have here with a big building with the pagoda right next to it. And that huge building would be perfect for a Eurofighter station, which is a coaster type that needs this huge white station block, and then you also need to build a queue and an exit right next to it. So generally speaking, you need a building that's at least 5 tiles wide. So I knew if I wanted to build a Eurofighter in my park, this would have to be one of the biggest buildings. So just to make sure that it fits right, I decided to create this whole scene and try to work out how the layout will go later. I honestly have no idea what the layout for this coaster is going to be yet. I'm gonna figure that out soon enough, but at least for now we've got a station going. Also, and I'm not sure why I keep doing this, but maybe it's just for my own sense of immersion, but all of the buildings that I'm building here, even if this game is from an isometric perspective, are technically completely fully supported, and you should be able to look inside these buildings and not have to notice any glaring missing things. So before I built the roof, I built this whole pillar structure around the building that the roof is gonna be laid on top of, and also made a new blueprint for the roof just so that I wouldn't have to build this thing completely from scratch, because this roof is absolutely huge and it's using lots of corner pieces, which are some of the hardest pieces to work with in this whole style of doing Asian roofs. But also I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. The way that the shape of the building works definitely manages to avoid the biggest potential hurdle with coaster stations, that is the station looking like a rectangle, which with all of these decorations and parts jutting out, I was pretty thankful didn't happen, even with this rectangular top part. Speaking of which, I got a lot of inspiration for this actually from some real-life Chinese buildings. Specifically something that I saw on, I think it was, Facebook actually recently. So I actually took a little bit to look at my Facebook again there because I saved it a while ago. But yeah, so basically the city of Chongqing, which is one of the biggest cities in China and an absolute mega city, which I think many people around the world forget kind of exists or don't know at all, has really interesting architecture because it's a city really built on hills. It's got metro lines going through buildings and ridiculous things like that, but it also has an old town center that's located on the hillside, and it has some really amazing buildings with really interesting walls and just lots of details that you can copy for anything Chinese inspired. So generally, if you're building anything Chinese in a game like Parkitect, I would highly recommend looking at the city. But even if you don't, it's such a cool city to just look up pictures of, because it has crazy situations where you've got roads on top of buildings and it's just insane. It's one of the most vertical cities in the world, probably, definitely of its size. Anyway, with all that said, let's get back into a quick real-time section and see what the park is actually like after all this development. I think this is my longest time-lapse section ever, so apologies for that long sit, but let's take a look at how this thing turned out so far. So here we are, after a bunch of color changes. I think I've arrived at a color scheme that I like for this general area. So it's pretty simple, honestly. It looks a lot more complicated than it really is, just because of all the scenery kind of hiding stuff. But in reality, everything's quite flat, of course. I am trying to connect different levels with lots of different paths, but it's really the buildings that make this look more intricate than it really is. But still, I love the layeredness that you get as a result of the terraforming in this park. And real quick, let's follow the coaster and see where it goes, how it goes. So first off, we start off with a launch with a 0G roll right over the entrance area into this kind of strange, wonky turnaround element on a different, well, terraforming platform, I suppose, with a loop here going through what's going to be some kind of future connection to a different part of the park. Now I'm quickly going to turn around because I do think you get some better views of this part, this perspective. And then we slide on over to the waterfall where we have the mid-course brake run into this bizarre kind of corkscrew contraption, which I did rework a little bit. I don't know if I featured that in a time-lapse, but I think I didn't. Just to make it a bit smoother and make sure it wasn't as ridiculously snappy as it used to be. Also, this is really just a trim break, if I remember correctly, just to get this thing up to the right speed. But yeah, it's not something that's super important otherwise. So that's it for the layout of the coaster, and then for the layout of the rest of the park, I think I'm mostly going to follow this general theme for basically all of the areas of the park. Just keep on building these kinds of houses, see what other rides and flat rides I can fit in here. But most importantly, I want to see what I can do with this area, which will probably be a bit more, you know, consistent in terms of style. Because the very idea of all of this is that it's just kind of random buildings that are built over time and you get its sort of town look to it. Whereas this could be some kind of temple complex or something like that. So it's all going to be a bit more consistent. And of course, in the future, this is going to be a Eurofighter station. So I have no idea how that layout's going to go because I built the station before I built the rest of the layout. But I'm going to try and figure something out. Anyway, let's keep going and see where we end up. So completely different topic, by the way, that I just wanted to quickly talk about. I recently had a very small discussion with some people on Discord what kind of things people do while they're watching my videos. That sounds kind of weird, but basically I mean, do you just completely watch these videos with your full attention or do something different in the meantime? I hear many people just watch my videos while playing games themselves and just put it on a second screen or something like that. Or I've read many people who post comments that they watch my videos while they're in bed to fall asleep. Apparently my voice is very conducive to that. I'll take it as a compliment. But yeah, I'm always just kind of curious, especially for videos like this one, which is extremely long. I couldn't imagine having your complete attention, you know, focused on this video. Maybe even have to break it up in parts. I don't know. Anyway, that's just my little ramblings about that. Now let's talk about the layouts for this coaster real quick, because this thing gave me a headache. Like, I started off with so many ideas that just completely didn't work, and I think that's just sort of the thing that happens when you build layouts without a prior idea of where you can place certain elements. Usually when I start building things, you know, at least get a general idea of this is where the lift hill can be, this is where the first drop's gonna be, and especially if you have to work with difficult terrain, you can kind of plan out some kind of plan de campagne of, you know, where am I gonna go with this thing. With this one, I had no idea, and that certainly didn't work out very well. For the first few attempts, I tried to do a first drop over the water, right next to the waterfall, doing it straight or curved or something like that. All of that really didn't work, so I eventually ended up with this solution where the coaster goes down a little bit, has a sort of pre-drop part where it meanders a bit, and then you go into a mid-course brake run before you get into the actual layout. And then, funnily enough, it drops down with a vertical drop, which is, of course, what Eurofighters do, but this is not really a typical Eurofighter because it doesn't start off with a vertical lift hill. It just does a vertical drop from a cliffside. Into a slightly more typical Eurofighter fare, although it is of course trying to snake around these different pillar terrain things, and I was really making this hard for myself, but I wanted to make sure that this coaster would explore this whole valley, and I wanted to give it decent, realistic, smooth elements, but at the same time I had to dodge all of these stupid terrain pillars everywhere and try to avoid accidentally building tunnels. So yeah, there was a lot of trying to figure out how pieces could fit together and eventually also get back into the station while leaving enough room for the whole path network that I needed to even get to the station in the first place, because you do have that path leading up to this area from the entrance, ending on that little terrain pillar that you see in the bottom right of the screen. So this whole thing was just a giant logistical puzzle, and I honestly don't know how real-life theme parks like Phantasialand, for instance, do that insane stuff where they try to make all of the buildings and rides and paths fit into a certain space, because it's really difficult, honestly. Working with a flat scenario is so much easier, and it gives you well, fewer headaches, but at the same time, I would say this is exactly the kind of thing I like as a challenge in a scenario, and I think it usually makes you a little bit more creative as well, and it's something that really helped out in this layout. For instance, the way that the beginning and the ending of this layout work with that drop from the cliffside and stuff like that, that never would have happened without this terrain. So while it's really difficult and you often find yourself not being able to do things that you want to do at first, when you take that time that you're forced to take to think about it more and figure out solutions for it, you very often end up with things that are much more interesting than what you were originally going for. At least I tend to think that it goes like this in my experience, so that's part of the fun of scenarios like these, I think, and why I'm pretty happy with how this has worked out, because it's a really unique take on terraforming. Not just in real life, these are very unique mountains, but in the game it just creates this strange gameplay mechanic as well. And that actually reminds me to talk about something that I haven't really talked about in this video so far, but that's actually kind of a key part of my whole philosophy with how I'm tackling this scenario. You might have noticed, and it's definitely a big part of everything that I've been doing so far, but I'm trying to keep all of the paths on top of the terrain pillars and the plateaus and whatever kind of things they are. Anyway, the paths are always at the high elevation, and then the coasters are the only things that are ever dropping down to the quote-unquote ground and to these parts between the mountains. So I decided to keep it very strictly separated this way, because I knew that, you know, keeping all of the paths and rides on top of these hills would make them super crammed, and I think the more empty areas with just a few trees and coasters between all of these areas on top of the hills works out to balance the look of this scenario a little bit. I think there are very few things which are worse than looking at a park in Parkitect where everything is detailed and there's stuff to look at everywhere, like a giant Where's Waldo drawing. It's just very confusing, and the eye doesn't really know where to look at, and it's part of, you know, a painting to try and figure out a certain area or object or whatever you're trying to get the eye to focus attention on first. And I think it's kind of similar in definitely theme parks in real life, but even to an extent in isometric games like Parkitect, where you can't just fill the screen with things everywhere. You need some areas of less focus here and there to try and direct people's eyes. And yeah, that's kind of what the background works for in this scenario, I suppose. The lower areas are really just kind of the background to the foreground that's on top of these hills, with all of the buildings and the paths and rides and all of that good stuff. So yeah, that was my thought process going into this scenario, and that's why I'm really trying to cram everything on top of these hills, and why certain areas of the park are just extremely busy and other areas are much more open and I leave almost empty. And I've talked about this a little bit with Robo Park as well, but I think the effect is much more important in this scenario. And especially given the fact that it's a really big scenario with a very unique set of terrain, I think it's very important to try and pay some attention to where you're actually placing your detail. Anyway, moving on, I decided to finish the big temple complex thingamajig that the Eurofighter is located in by building a giant building for the block breaks at the end of the ride, which I suppose in real life, you know, if I wanted to do this thing completely realistically, could house the transfer track. I think my brain just kind of merged two words there. But yeah, in this case, I'm not going quite into that detail, but it still, you know, kind of creates the illusion of a giant set of buildings that are housing all kinds of important stuff for this coaster and kind of giving it a home base. And it's also interesting how it gets a really unique interaction, because it means the block breaks are on top of the first drop of the coaster, and I don't think there's a single roller coaster in the world where that happens. It's a really unique setup here. I suppose you could say that the very gentle small drop coming out of the station is the first drop of the ride, but let's be realistic here, it doesn't really work that way. The drop coming out of the building here is definitely the first drop. So it's a very unique set of very unique general layout here, but I think it kind of works to make the first drop a little bit more interesting as well. First, you just have this high altitude area where you do a curve and an S-bend, then you move into the building, and it means you can't really see the drop all that clear. You can barely even see that you're going to drop, and then you come out of the building, and just after braking a little bit, because there is a block break over there, you crash vertically into the cliffside, and you start the kind of insane layout of this coaster. So I think, yeah, it kind of works in this setting. And then I decided to, you know, connect these two buildings with some roofs, which also double as the queue cover, because there is very little space on this hill. I keep calling them hills and mountains, but honestly, I wouldn't know what to call these things. Plateaus? They don't really make sense. They're almost kind of like islands, and in a way I'm really treating them with islands with bridges in between them and trying to fit everything as tightly as possible as I can on these islands. Anyway, yeah, there's very little space left on this island, hill, mountain, whatever you want to call it. So the queue just kind of has to be placed inside this building to leave just enough space around these buildings to also leave it a little bit more open and have some greenery and foliage and stuff over there. Because as always, I'm trying not to fill every single square of these things with paths and things that are necessary. Gotta have some emptiness in there as well. And now it's time to bridge the gap between this big island, mountain, hill thing. I need to stick with a certain word. You know what? I'm just gonna call them islands. Yeah, because that's basically what they are. You know, at least for my paths and stuff. So I'm covering the gap for this between these two islands with another bridge. I had to keep this one more simple than I wanted to. I was trying to come up with all kinds of elaborate designs in my head and testing out a few things, and then I realized, wait a second, the coaster is passing right underneath these things, and if I built any kind of supporting structure other than just straight stone beams on this thing, the heads of guests on the coaster would surely crash into the bridge, which wouldn't be very nice. So I decided to keep this thing very simple, but of course I wanted to come up with a slightly different design for this bridge than everything so far. So what I'm going with is a kind of simple stone base, and then a very simple red fence as well, which is not as tall and detailed as most of the fences in this map, but you know, it's another slight variation on some other designs. So I think it was better to keep this one a bit more simple than try and go with some of the fancier ones that you see throughout this scenario. Now, at this point I was trying to figure out how this coaster would work in terms of block breaks, because it's a little bit tricky to get this thing to work right, because there's not really a proper mid-course brake run, and instead there's a block break very shortly after the station, and there's a bunch of block breaks right after the end of the layout. So eventually I got the right timing on this thing to make sure that the cars would never wait too long on any of the block breaks, but I'm still making use of as much throughput as I can, because that's definitely something you have to watch out for when you're building Eurofighters. Those things, at least the trains themselves, have a very small capacity. Now at this point I decided it was time to go back to an area of the park I haven't tackled in quite a while, because I just didn't know what to do with it. And to be completely honest, when I started building this, I still wasn't completely sure. I just had some ideas I tested with some flatrides in this area and figured it was the best thing to do, and just gave it a shot from there. I decided to place the Riptide because it just looked the best. I could have placed the pirate ship here, but I think that would have made no sense given the theme of the scenario. I didn't want to place anything too tall in here either, because it would block the view of the temple from this part of the park, which, you know, of course is not really a concern for me myself, but for any of the guests walking in that area of the park, it would just ruin the weenie that is the temple. Also, these are the kind of moments that kind of make me wish that, you know, you could look at Parkitect as a 3D game and from the perspective of the guests. And I know there are mods to do this thing, but I am sticking to the completely vanilla game for this campaign playthrough, not to cheat or show anything that isn't possible with the base game. So that's how it is, but at the same time, I feel like this would actually be such a cool sightline, and I did try to work it out as such. Because even though you can't really see from the perspective of guests in this game, I still think it makes sense to try and design things from the perspective of guests, because that's something that real-life theme parks do, and if you end up, at least taking it into consideration, I think you'll end up with some more realistic layouts. So for instance, placing your weenies at the end of a main street, things like that, which happen in real life because that's how perspective works. You should definitely try to copy those things in Parkitect as well, even if it's just an isometric game. Now here I started supporting the backside of the coaster here. I wasn't too sure what to do with it for a while, but decided eventually this was probably the best way to go about doing this thing, just to get rid of the coaster's own supports. And then there's a little bit of rock work and foliage work to do over here as well. I ended up placing lots of rock besides the cliffs that you start out with in this scenario, because it just looks so much better if you kind of intersperse the in-game terraforming with the in-game rock pieces and really try to make those rock pieces huge, so you can make some interesting textures and shapes on the sides of those cliffs and make them look a little bit more realistic. But it's definitely something that I sunk quite a bit of time into during this playthrough. Not to mention that I could only get away with this stuff because I'm earning loads of money, because big rocks in Parkitect are very expensive. If you're watching this and you don't have any experience with this in the game itself, you can, recolor and reshape any object you want in this game, but reshaping objects makes them more expensive as well. And that stuff exponentially increases costs of rock work if you make your rocks huge. You can easily pay hundreds of dollars just for a single rock piece that way. And well, just go ahead and figure out how many rock pieces I'm sinking into all of these cliff faces. It's a lot of money I'm sinking into scenery, and probably, I would reckon this scenario probably has some of the most expensive scenery, if not the most expensive scenery I've ever done in a scenario. And really, I have to give props to the spinning coaster for being an absolute statistics beast and just earning me all of this cash, because it wouldn't be possible without the spinning coaster. Anyway, going back to this area of the park, I finally figured out what I wanted to do with the smallest empty spot that was left here. I decided just to build a very typical shaped Asian merchant house. It's gonna be the only building with this shape in the map, which is kind of funny because you see many buildings with this kind of shape in China and Japan. But it's a more standard shape, really. You'll find that the only buildings in Asia which really feature those super lavish, lush, rounded, decorated roofs are typically religious buildings and the like, very special places or palaces. It's not something that you'll find everyday buildings having, and that little building over there was a little bit more of an everyday building type of design. I know that sounds very vague, but I didn't look too much into it either. It's Parkitect, what can I say? And finally, I wanted to build, hopefully, the last ride of this scenario. I know I'm barely even at 400 guests, but at this time, I was placing all of my bets on advertisements being able to pull through and getting me to 800 guests after I finished this ride alone. If that wouldn't happen, then I'm kind of screwed. I'm gonna have to come up with a way to retrofit this park with more rides, but I'm fairly certain, it's gonna happen. No spoilers. But yeah, I didn't show any footage of me building this ride because I forgot to record it. It's as simple as that. Sometimes it just be like that. That said, it's not super interesting, I guess. It's just a powered coaster. It does some turns, it does some helixes, it goes up, it goes down, it's at a speed. It speeds along the layout. That's basically what it does. Honestly, powered coasters are not that interesting in real life. I just wanted to build one of these in this scenario because I don't build many of them, which is probably because I'm not a huge fan of them in real life. But in Parkitect, they can actually come through and you can make some really interesting layouts with them. Take, for instance, this layout. You don't have to worry about a lift hill, which is something that, I didn't see a logical place for anywhere on this map, or at least this part of the map, but I didn't have to worry about it because this is a powered coaster. You can put this thing anywhere you want, you can make it go anywhere you want, and you can just set a speed for it. So when it comes to themed areas and trying to cram coasters into certain spaces, I think they work really well. And also, I know I've been hating on the powered coaster a little bit now, but I think this is one of the things they do best is be integrated into general themed areas, because they don't have to worry so much about the way that their layout is going. I've seen and ridden many powered coasters that do really interesting things with scenery, interaction with other rides and with paths, and that's always really fun. So yeah, these things aren't so bad. It's just that I'm gonna have to be honest. Roller coasters powered by gravity are just more fun. Hell, there are just even people who argue that these things aren't really roller coasters, because while they are semi-powered by gravity, because they do go faster and slower depending on going up and down certain parts of the track, they are powered very much in the same way a dark ride would be. So it's the everlasting conflict of what's a roller coaster, what isn't. It's always fun to discuss. I tend to be of the opinion, by the way, that anything that's on Roller Coaster Database is a roller coaster, with the exception of butterflies. Butterflies are not roller coasters. For anybody who's in the know, or who's not in the know, actually, I should say, butterflies are basically playground equipment. They bring you up a little hill and then you start swinging from side to side. But because you're on a vehicle and it has wheels and it's powered by gravity, RCDB says it's a roller coaster. I say that's nonsense. Anyway, I'm getting very off topic. The actual last ride of this scenario that I almost just forgot about is the drop tower. And I suppose this would be an Intamin drop tower in real life. The Roto drop, as it used to be known in Roller Coaster Tycoon as well. And I wanted to go for this drop tower specifically because it's perfectly on the grid, which meant that I could place my little Chinese roof on that thing and add some decoration to it, which is a little bit cheesy. I'll show it a little bit at the end of this video, but yeah, it's definitely something. But I figured it was better than nothing, and I've always wanted to try and play around with it, because to my knowledge, I have never really themed a drop tower like that. I've definitely kind of pimped some of them, but not this specific type, and I think not with a theme like this. But maybe I need to refresh my memory on things I've done in the past. I'm pretty sure of it. So I'm keeping everything else on this island very simple. We just have a queue and some simple decorations around this thing. I had to kind of watch out with these roofs not hitting people in the face as they drop down from this thing, because the corners that I made for these Chinese roofs really stick out almost a full tile, which meant that people's face would be hit by a beam, which at, you know, the high speeds of a drop tower wouldn't be super comfortable. So eventually I just ended up cutting the ends of this roof off, which doesn't even look too bad, and it kind of makes this roof unique in the map. So all things considered, I consider it a pretty decent job there. And finally, it's time to pimp this island a little bit, add some rock work to it, some foliage, make the paths a little bit nicer, and yeah, that's basically everything I ended up doing for this scenario. So let's cut to the final bit of real-time footage and see how this park ended up. So every time I do this, I wonder to myself whether this is one of those scenarios where you have to hold the goals for a while, or you can just do them instantly. Looks like we can just do them all at once. Yeah, there we go. Awesome. So that's Dragon Valley, and well, as I expected, it went into over an hour of time-lapse, even though I was already trying to cut out some footage. But, you know, it is what it is. This is also one of my favorite scenarios so far. I think it's my favorite result from everything in the Taste of Adventure DLC so far. But, man, it's been a lot of work to get here. Let's quickly close this video off with some POVs of some of the coasters. Let's start off with the vertical drop coaster. So, as we know, we get this interesting element here where we kind of slow down a bit on the brakes over there before we go into the drop here. I eventually turned those block brakes into regular brakes, even though they started off as block brakes, just to make sure that the cars wouldn't stop there for too long if anything went wrong, or if the coaster started breaking down or anything like that. But yeah, after that we just have a meandering layout going through the valley, as of course the strategy is to keep all of the paths on top of the hills and have the coasters go through the valley, and I think this more or less works for it. It's not really a Eurofighter per se, and I think if we had infinity coasters in this game, I probably would have gone for an infinity coaster on this one. That said, it's still fun to have that typical vertical drop, and the lift hill is almost a Eurofighter lift hill. Maybe just not quite, but you know, it's getting there. And then of course we have the powered coaster. Let's give it a quick POV as well. I never noticed these little icons. Hold up. I think these are speed icons indicating which... Yeah, that's cool, actually. I never noticed that about the powered coaster, because the way that the powered coaster works is you have different segments you set at different speeds. So for this one, I set the speed at the lowest parts, the highest. And then up here it's still a little bit, slower. And then once you get into the second part of the layout, into this helix after this big drop, it reaches the max speed. I didn't know you had these little things indicating where the speed would change. That's really interesting. Also, I'm sorry if I totally went off topic there. It's just something I never noticed. But yeah, this is just a powered coaster, as you're kind of used to these things, although I think it's a little bit more intense than you usually see these layouts being in real life. First half of the layout is not too fast, but then we get into this, well, kind of crazy helix segment here, and then some interaction with the spinning coaster, and finally a very steep hill back into the station where it actually kind of naturally slows down as well. And then we go back for a second round. So... honestly, I'm not going to show that whole second round, but that's the powered coaster. Also, it has a kind of simple station. To be very honest, at this point, I was kind of done with this whole theme and doing these buildings. That said, I do think this is probably one of my favorite buildings. It's not the most interesting per se, but if I were to continue building in this style, I would consider this one of the example buildings. It's very typical. It uses the roofs. It has the simple decoration on top. It's a simple shape, but it just kind of works. And I put a lot of foliage around it to make it feel like it's not too much part of a village like these parts of the park are, or this part. But it still works. It still functions as a decent station building, I think. And then of course we have the buildings for the Eurofighter, which is this giant temple complex, which works out pretty well, I think. For one, we have the block breaks over here, which are all at the end of the layout, so in case anything goes wrong, at least the trains can stack over here and not in the middle of the layout. And we have this interesting view at the back as well. I decided to support this piece of track with some wooden bracing beams as opposed to using the in-game supports, because I thought it would keep this interesting cliff face intact. And even though this is the back side of this temple and it really is intended as such, I wanted to at least make it look interesting from that side as well. But really this view over here is the main attraction of this park. Definitely also kind of made to be a thumbnail. I know this is not something I mention very often, but usually when I'm building I also try to think of what areas could be the thumbnail for the video, and this is just there's rarely been a more clear contender than this one. I also like the bit of interaction it ends up getting here when you cross underneath the block breaks to do the first drop. That's definitely a very unique setup, and it's the kind of thing where I wouldn't have come up with that, if it weren't for just the creative limitations of the map basically forcing me to do that. So it's something that just kind of happens, but I think it worked out pretty decently. And then we have the drop tower, which honestly, I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of this thing. It looks a little bit silly, but it's really too big of a structure to completely enclose in a building without making it look weird. So this is at least something. There was an attempt at theming this thing. So yeah, that's it for Dragon Valley. I think I'm mostly done showing you all of this stuff. Let's quickly head back. Actually, I'm gonna save before I leave. There you see my multiple saves, just to make sure that I never end up with a save that's gonna be a dead end. But let's quit and see what's the trophy for... Ooh, that's interesting. Let's see what the trophy is for this map. It kind of glitched out for a second there. Alright, so it's the building that is just out of out of reach for this actual map, but I think that works all right. And then we go to the next one, which, if I remember correctly, is it this one? Yeah, there we go. It's Victoria Island. So that's going to be interesting. Not quite going to tell you why. Well, I guess you can read. I guess we're not going to be able to buy up all of the remaining land because it's going to be super expensive. So another one of these scenarios where the amount of available land to build on is going to be part of the challenge. But, you know, that's something for next time. This video is long enough as it is. Wait a second, there's a floating ship. I only just noticed that. Anyway, I'm going to close the video here. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next episode.